The night carried with it a silence so heavy that even the wind seemed afraid to disturb it. And in that silence lived a woman whose life had been built on secrets she never chose. A woman who thought she had finally escaped the cruelty of fate, only to discover that destiny had saved its darkest strike for her heart. Because what she believed to be love, safety, and family was nothing more than the cruelest deception that blood could weave. And the moment truth surfaced, her world shattered into pieces sharper than glass, each shard cutting deeper than any blade ever could, leaving her breathless, haunted, and consumed by a thirst for answers that soon grew into a hunger for justice, and then into something darker, something that whispered of revenge as the only cure for her torment. For in the quiet of her home, where laughter once lived, shadows had begun to linger, whispering of betrayals she never imagined possible, whispering of curses born not from ancient legends but from the sins of her own kin, curses that made every kiss she shared with her husband feel poisoned, every memory a trap waiting to crush her under the weight of its horror. And in those moments of dawning realization, when truth became a living nightmare, she could not scream, she could not cry. She could only stare into the emptiness of her life and wonder how long she had been nothing more than a puppet in a play directed by the cruel hand of secrecy. She had grown up believing herself ordinary, perhaps a little unlucky, perhaps a little overlooked by fortune, but never cursed, never doomed, until she met him, the man who appeared as the only light in a world that had always felt cold, a man whose voice steadied her storms and whose touch made her forget the scars she carried. And when he placed a ring on her finger and vowed to stand beside her forever, she thought at last she had been chosen. At last she belonged. At last the world had given her something pure. But purity was a lie, for blood bound them long before love. And the vows they made became shackles forged by cruelty disguised as fate. And she realized too late that every step she had taken toward happiness had been a step deeper into a grave dug by her own bloodline. And now she could not climb out. Now she could only fall further, every heartbeat an echo of betrayal, every breath a reminder that she had shared her life, her body, her dreams with the one person she never should have touched. And yet none of it was her doing, none of it her sin, for she had been kept in darkness, trapped by silence, denied the truth of her origin, until the truth revealed itself like a blade pressed against her throat, daring her to move, daring her to live another day with this unbearable knowledge. In the dark corners of her mind, fury began to grow, not against herself but against those who had stolen her choice, those who had hidden the truth, those who had turned her love into a curse. And that fury grew like fire, feeding on every injustice she had endured, until it demanded action, demanded reckoning, demanded that those who had orchestrated her misery feel what she felt, know what she knew, and bleed as she bled, for she understood now that there are wounds deeper than flesh, wounds that no time can heal, wounds carved by betrayal, and betrayal by blood is the deepest cut of all. And once she tasted its bitterness, she knew she could never go back to being the woman she once was. She could never look at the world the same way, because innocence had been stolen, and in its place stood something harder, sharper, colder, a version of her that no longer wept in silence but planned in silence, no longer begged for comfort but craved revenge, no longer trusted in destiny but sought to rewrite it with her own hands. And in that silence where her heart broke, something else was born, something powerful, something dangerous. And though she could not yet see the path ahead, she felt it twisting around her like a serpent, waiting for her to embrace it fully, waiting for her to strike. Because fate had played its cruel trick, but now it was her turn, and when she struck, the world would know that she had suffered too long, been deceived too deeply, and that her revenge would not be whispered but screamed into the bones of those who had condemned her to this curse. For if life had turned her marriage into a nightmare, she would turn her pain into their punishment. And if blood had betrayed her, then blood would pay the price. And in that vow, silent and searing, her story truly began. She had always believed that life's cruelties came in small doses, moments of hunger, moments of loss, moments when the world looked away while she carried burdens no one else could see. Yet nothing had prepared her for the cruelty that had been written into her very blood long before she took her first breath. For her story had been shaped by silence, by secrets kept in locked rooms and whispers that died before they reached her ears. And when she discovered the truth, it did not come gently. It came like a storm tearing through her chest, ripping apart the fragile fabric of every memory she had cherished. And suddenly the past was not a place of innocence, but a field of landmines waiting for her to step and explode, leaving her shattered again and again. For the family that should have protected her had betrayed her in the worst way imaginable. They had let her live in ignorance, let her walk down the aisle, let her believe in love, while knowing the man she trusted above all was the one person she should have been shielded from. And that betrayal was not only personal, it was criminal, it was wicked, it was a theft of her humanity. And as she replayed every embrace, every word of comfort, every night of closeness, she felt as though she had been living inside a carefully built coffin, breathing but already buried, and she asked herself how people could be so cruel, how a family could guard such a monstrous truth and watch her walk blindly into ruin, how they could let her body and soul be bound to a curse they had created. And each question burned hotter until they no longer sounded like questions but accusations, thunderous accusations echoing in her veins, demanding answers, demanding retribution. For she knew that love was supposed to save, not destroy, supposed to heal, not poison. But what she had been given was not love. It was a sentence, and she was the prisoner, locked away with chains invisible to the world yet heavier than any iron. And now she understood that the laughter she once heard from her family was not laughter at joy, but laughter at her blindness, that their silence was not protection but complicity. And the thought that they had stolen not only her innocence but her right to choose filled her with a fury so sharp she could feel it tearing her apart from within, a fury that demanded not just justice but vengeance, not just truth, but suffering for those who had let her life rot under the weight of their deception. And as she stood at the threshold of her broken reality, she realized that nothing about her future would be ordinary, nothing about her days ahead would be peaceful, because peace had been murdered the moment truth was revealed. And in its grave rose a new self, one who carried shadows in her eyes and steel in her soul, one who would no longer accept the role of victim, one who would no longer tremble in silence but would strike back with the same cruelty that had been dealt to her. For every injustice sows the seed of rebellion, and hers had grown into a forest of rage, a place where mercy could not live, where forgiveness had been strangled. And all that remained was the voice inside her whispering that the only way forward was to make them pay, to make them feel the weight of their own sins, to watch their world collapse as hers had. And though the path ahead was dark, though it promised pain, she felt no fear, for fear had abandoned her the moment betrayal kissed her lips, and in its place stood resolve, unshakable and consuming. And in that resolve she found a strange strength, the kind that comes when everything has already been stolen, when there is nothing left to lose but everything to avenge. And so the woman who once dreamed of love now dreamed of fire, of breaking the silence with screams, of turning the curse they gave her into the weapon that would undo them. And as night stretched around her like an endless shroud, she swore that her pain would not be wasted, her tears would not be forgotten, her story would not be one of quiet suffering, it would be one of reckoning. And when the reckoning came, it would shake not only her family, but every soul who had ever believed secrets could remain buried, because she had lived the proof that secrets do not die. They grow, they fester, they curse, and when they rise, they devour. And now she would be the one to feed that curse back to its creators until nothing remained but ash. The days after the revelation did not pass like ordinary days. They crawled like wounded creatures, bleeding with memories that turned into nightmares each time she closed her eyes. And though the sun rose and set as it always had, for her the world remained in darkness, every light dimmed by the truth she carried, and the man she once called her husband, the man whose voice once calmed the storms inside her, now became the very embodiment of her torment. Every glance at him a reminder of the curse stitched into her life, every touch a blade cutting into her skin. And yet he looked at her with the same affection, the same tenderness, oblivious to the truth or perhaps chained to the same silence that had trapped her, and in that uncertainty lived a deeper pain, because she could not decide whether he was her partner in tragedy or the anchor of her suffering. And the more she thought of it, the more her mind began to fracture, dividing into questions that had no answers, into rage that had no outlet, into grief that had no grave, and she began to wander the halls of her home like a shadow, her eyes searching for cracks where the lies had been hidden, her ears straining to catch whispers from the past that might explain how such a horror had been allowed to exist. And with every step the walls seemed to close in, the air thickening with betrayal until she could barely breathe. And yet she did not collapse. She did not surrender. Because within that suffocating silence her fury sharpened, shaping itself into something more dangerous, something more deliberate. For she understood now that pain without direction is destruction, but pain with purpose is power. And she would not waste her pain. She would not let it consume only her. She would turn it outward. She would forge it into the kind of weapon no one could see coming. And when the time was right, she would strike. Not with blind rage, but with the precision of someone who has been forced to study every cruelty, every injustice, every silence, and has learned how to make silence scream. She began to remember her childhood differently, the way her mother's eyes would sometimes linger on her with a sadness she could not name, the way certain questions about her past were always met with deflections, the way relatives avoided conversations about bloodlines and heritage. And suddenly those moments fit together like jagged pieces of glass, forming a picture too cruel to behold, a picture of deliberate concealment, of choices made not to protect her but to protect themselves, to protect reputations, to bury sins under the weight of her ignorance. And she realized that her life had been nothing more than a stage set carefully by those who feared the truth more than they loved her. And that realization deepened her resolve until it became unbreakable. For now she understood that the curse was not some supernatural punishment, but the result of human cowardice, human selfishness, human betrayal. And if humans had created it, then humans could be made to pay for it. Her nights became laboratories of thought where she dissected every interaction, every lie, every silence, searching for the threads she could pull to unravel the tapestry of deceit that bound her. And the more she searched, the more she saw how fragile their lies truly were, how easily the truth could be turned into a blade against them. And she began to plan, quietly, methodically, with the patience of someone who has nothing left but the desire to watch her betrayers fall. And though her heart still ached, though her body still trembled with the weight of what she had endured, there was a new steadiness in her eyes, a steadiness that comes when a victim becomes a hunter, when the hunted becomes the predator. And in that transformation lived the first spark of freedom she had felt in years, a freedom not given but taken, not gentle but fierce, not pure but poisoned, and yet it was hers, and she would wield it until the silence that destroyed her was replaced by screams. The people around her still saw her as the same woman, still smiled at her, still greeted her with the same casual warmth, unaware that beneath her calm surface there raged a storm waiting to break. And she played along, she nodded, she smiled, she spoke when spoken to. But inside she was rewriting the script, replacing the role of victim with that of judge, jury, and executioner, and every word she spoke was measured, every glance calculated, every silence sharpened. Because she knew that power does not always come from loud declarations. Sometimes the greatest power is in silence, in watching, in waiting, in letting others reveal themselves. And she was prepared to wait as long as it took, for she had already lost everything. And when one has nothing left to lose, patience becomes a weapon. And hers would cut deeper than any blade when the time came. The nights grew longer, as if time itself had slowed to mock her, stretching every second into an echo of torment. Yet within that slow crawl she found clarity, because suffering, when endured too long, sharpens rather than weakens. And the more she carried the weight of betrayal, the more her spine hardened against it, until she no longer felt like a broken woman but like a vessel filled with something far stronger than grief. And she knew that to confront the truth, she must first confront herself, peel away the illusions that still clung to her memories, destroy the fragile dream of love that haunted her, and only then would she be free to act without hesitation, without remorse, without mercy. And so she began to study the man she had once called her husband, watching his movements, listening to his words, seeking in him the trace of guilt, the shadow of awareness. And though he seemed as blind as she once was, his kindness now appeared to her as another form of cruelty, because whether he knew or not, whether he shared her ignorance or her curse, he had still been part of the deception, still been bound to her in a way that violated everything sacred. And the more she thought of him, the more she realized that love had turned into poison, that his presence in her life was no longer comfort, but contamination, and that to cleanse herself she would have to destroy not only those who kept secrets, but also the bond that made her complicit in her own undoing. And that realization twisted inside her like a blade, but it also gave her direction, a cruel clarity that whispered to her at night, telling her that if blood had cursed her, then blood must be the sacrifice. And though her hands trembled at the thought, her heart steadied, because she understood that the difference between victimhood and vengeance is not the absence of fear, but the refusal to let fear decide. And she had decided. She had chosen. And now there was no return, only the slow, deliberate march toward the moment when silence would end in screams. She wandered through her family's history like a ghost haunting its own past, digging through records, letters, fragments of conversations she remembered from years ago, piecing together the trail of lies. And with each discovery she felt herself growing colder, harder, sharper, until even her reflection in the mirror began to look like a stranger's. Eyes that once searched for love now burned with calculation. Lips that once whispered dreams now sealed themselves in silence. And the transformation frightened her at first, but soon she embraced it, because she knew that to face monsters one must become something darker than innocence, something that shadows fear, and she was becoming that shadow, step by step, breath by breath, until the woman who once laughed easily, who once believed in happy endings, was gone, replaced by something stronger, something unbreakable. The people around her still tried to treat her the same, still expected her to smile, to play her part, to remain silent as she always had, but they did not see that silence had turned into her weapon, and every polite nod, every quiet glance, was another stone she laid on the path that would lead them all to ruin. And though they believed themselves safe, protected by tradition, by secrecy, by the weight of years, she knew their fortress was made of glass, and all it would take was the right strike to shatter it into shards that would cut them as deeply as she had been cut. And she intended to be that strike, to bring their silence crashing down in screams so loud the world could not ignore them. But vengeance is not only about destruction, it is about patience, about letting fear grow inside the enemy before the blow lands. And so she waited, she studied, she played her role, all the while her mind building a map of their weaknesses, their hypocrisies, their hidden fears. And she began to see that the same silence which had destroyed her would now destroy them, because secrets only have power when they are hidden, and once exposed they devour their keepers, and she would be the one to tear the veil. She would be the one to let their own curse devour them. And as she planned, she began to feel something unexpected, a strange power rising inside her, a sense that she was no longer bound by the same rules that chained others. That betrayal had burned away the illusions of morality, of tradition, of forgiveness, and left her with something purer, something sharper, the raw essence of will. And she knew then that power is not given, it is taken, it is forged in fire, and her fire had been lit by betrayal, and now it raged too fiercely to be extinguished. And those who had fed it would soon be consumed by it, because the curse they created was no longer her burden, it was her weapon, and she would wield it until nothing of their silence remained but ashes scattered on the wind. She began to see the world not as it was, but as it truly had always been, a stage where lies played as truth and silence served as applause for crimes committed in shadows. And with that vision she realized how blind she had once been, how easily she had been led, how every smile from her family was not warmth but a mask concealing rot. And the thought made her skin crawl until she wanted to tear the past from her body like a garment soaked in poison. But she knew she could not simply strip it away. She had to burn it, destroy it, erase it until there was no trace of the woman who had once believed in love. And in her determination a new strength was born, the kind that comes only to those who have been betrayed beyond repair, because once trust dies it does not return. It transforms into a hunger for justice that can only be satisfied with reckoning. And she carried that hunger in her every step, in her every breath, until it became the rhythm of her life, pounding through her veins like drums of war, reminding her that she was no longer a victim waiting for salvation, but an avenger preparing to strike. She began to test those around her, subtle questions dropped like stones into still waters, watching the ripples in their eyes, listening for the cracks in their voices, and slowly she uncovered layers of guilt they thought long buried. Tiny shifts in posture, nervous laughs, sudden silences, and though they tried to hold their masks in place, she saw through them. She saw the fear behind their eyes, and she knew then that they had always known what they had done. They had always carried the awareness of their cruelty, and the only reason they survived was because she had been kept in the dark. But now the dark belonged to her, and within it she moved unseen, weaving her plans, shaping her vengeance. And the irony of it made her smile for the first time in months, because the same silence that once crushed her was now her cloak, her shield, her power, and through it she would move like a shadow until the moment came to reveal everything. But vengeance was not enough. She wanted them to suffer as she had, to know not only fear but despair, to feel the ground beneath them collapse as theirs had collapsed beneath her. And so she began to design not just their downfall, but their unraveling, a slow tearing of their lives until nothing remained but the ruins of their own sins. And she knew that such punishment required more than anger. It required cunning. It required patience. And she possessed both now, sharpened by betrayal, strengthened by rage, and she wielded them like tools, cutting carefully at the edges of their comfort, loosening the threads of their lies, preparing the stage for the collapse that would come not as a sudden blow but as an inevitable fall, the kind that leaves no chance for recovery. At night she lay awake listening to the silence of the house, a silence that once felt suffocating but now felt alive, as though it whispered to her, guiding her, urging her to act. And she listened, because she knew the curse they had given her was not only a burden, but a voice, and that voice taught her that power is born in shadows, that revenge is patient, that justice waits but never forgets. And she allowed that voice to shape her, to transform her into something more than human, something that belonged neither fully to light nor fully to dark, but to the place where curses live and thrive. And in that place she found not fear but strength, the strength to become the very nightmare her family deserved. Yet beneath all her fury, buried deep where even she barely reached, there remained a faint ache, the echo of love she once believed real, the memory of tender moments with the man she thought was hers. And though she wanted to crush those memories, to erase them entirely, they clung to her like scars on skin, reminders that the line between love and horror is razor thin, and sometimes the sweetest moments hide the sharpest blades. And she realized that part of her revenge would not only be against her family, but against love itself, against the idea that she had ever needed it, ever believed in it. And so she vowed that she would never again surrender her heart, never again trust, never again dream. For dreams had betrayed her as deeply as people had, and she would not be betrayed twice. She would turn that betrayal into armor, into fire, into the very fuel that would burn her enemies to ash. And when they screamed, she would not look away. She would not falter, she would not forgive. For forgiveness is the final cruelty the victim shows to the guilty, and she had been too cruelly wronged to grant it. And so her path was set, unbending, merciless, and every step she took carried her closer to the moment when the silence of her life would erupt into a storm that no one could survive. She set the days like traps and the nights like classrooms where she refined her craft, learning how to bend people's perceptions until truth itself looked like a lie and lies looked like sanctity. And as she moved through the world, she became an artist of deception, painting a portrait of normalcy, while secretly sketching the map of ruin that would one day guide her hand. Because if they had used secrecy to shape her fate, she would use secrecy to shape theirs. And secrecy, she discovered, is a mirror. Look long enough and you begin to see not the face of the one you knew, but the outline of the betrayer reflected back, and she learned to look. She began to plant small doubts where they would grow into paralyzing fears, whispering carefully worded questions to confidants who would carry them like seeds into drawing rooms and dinner tables, letting gossip do her work while she kept watch from the shadows. And the cleverness of it was that she rarely spoke of the past directly. Instead, she moved like a surgeon, making tiny incisions into reputations, exposing contradictions, coaxing old allies into revealing truths they thought hidden. And as her campaign unfolded, the first fissures appeared in the family's facade. A cousin who once laughed too loudly at her wedding began to flinch at her name in conversation. An aunt who had always been perfectly composed now found her hands trembling when certain topics surfaced. And even the man she had married, who once hugged her as if to seal their world, began to hesitate at times, as though some invisible weight pressed between them. And each hesitation fed her plans. For fear is contagious, and once it takes hold, it spreads faster than any lie can. And she had set in motion an infection of doubt she would watch with the cold fascination of one who tends a slow-burning pyre. But while she worked externally, she also weaponized the law, quietly learning names, dates, records, the sort of details that can turn a rumor into a complaint and a complaint into evidence. Because secrets kept only by families rarely survive the light of formal scrutiny, and she was careful to assemble proof not for the sake of righteous indignation, but for a spectacle that would humiliate them in public. For humiliation is a kind of punishment that reaches where ordinary justice cannot, striking at pride, reputation, and the false sanctity they had wrapped around themselves. And she loved the thought of their high towers turning into glass that could be shattered by a single stone, the stone she would choose. As the cracks widened, she discovered allies where she expected none, servants who remembered whispered instructions, old friends who had been pushed away by the family's arrogance, and a distant relative who had quietly suffered for years under the same code of silence, and who now, seeing her resolve, chose to join her, not out of malice but from a desire for fairness that had been denied to them for lifetimes. And their testimonies became the threads she used to weave the tapestry of their exposure. Because the more voices that rose, the harder it would be for the keepers of lies to smother the truth. And she understood that collective revelation has a force all its own, a tidal quality that sweeps away carefully stacked denials. Yet amid this meticulous orchestration, she also nurtured a darker, more intimate strategy. She learned the private patterns of her betrayers, the way one particular uncle favored his whiskey at dusk to soothe conscience, the way the patriarch kept his ledger of favors in a drawer he thought no one opened, the way the man she had loved read the same old letters at night as if searching for an echo of a past that could justify his silence. And she used those patterns like keys, slipping into rooms when shadows lengthened, taking objects from drawers to leave in places that would spark memory, or sending a photograph that appeared in a public place where curiosity would do the rest. Because cruelty can be dismantled by reminding the cruel of the small things that make them human, and then exposing the contradiction, how a man who cries for a memory can be the same man who allowed another to suffer. As she worked, power shifted quietly in ways that surprised her. She had expected to feel hollow when they stumbled, to feel nothing but the cold pleasure of victory. But instead she felt a complex tide of satisfaction and sorrow, because the fall of those who had guarded lies revealed not monsters, but flawed humans who had chosen cowardice over courage. And that complexity sharpened her resolve to ensure the punishment fit the crime, to design consequences that matched the cruelty and the pretense, to make them pay not just in reputation but in the slow, stinging theft of the comforts they had always taken for granted. The man who had been her husband oscillated between confusion and anger as the tremor she had engineered began to unsettle his life. And in those moments she watched him with a clinical detachment, cataloging every reaction, learning whether guilt lived behind his eyes or only bewilderment at a world that no longer served him unquestioningly. And when at last his facade cracked and he sought her with desperate questions, she met him with a calm so composed it was nearly unkind. For she knew that the moment he demanded truth would be the moment the scales tipped. The moment his complicity, active or passive, could no longer be hidden behind the veil of marital intimacy, and she savored the slow unspooling of his defenses like a craftsman admiring the finish on a well-made piece. But the plan required risks, miscalculations that could ruin everything if she misjudged a temper, misread a loyalty, or acted too soon. And one evening, when a candle burned too low and a messenger arrived earlier than expected, a small error set off a chain of events that threatened to fracture the fragile advantage she had built. An overheard conversation, a note misplaced, a servant's panic, and suddenly suspicion turned to accusation, not only against the family but against her. For the world loves a tidy narrative, and a woman bent on vengeance is an easy villain to paint. And she found herself for the first time in months exposed to the harsh light she had used on others, feeling the sting of the same judgment she had inflicted. And in that moment she understood intimately the cost of her crusade. That righteous fury can become blind cruelty if one does not guard the heart, and she had to decide whether to press forward with the same unrelenting force or to temper her tactics with the small mercy that separates justice from simple revenge. And it was in that crucible she discovered a new facet of power: restraint, the ability to stop a blow before it kills and to let consequences teach rather than destroy. And she realized that her objective was not simply to break them, but to make their world reflect the pain they had caused, so that no one could ever again pretend ignorance. For true change requires clarity, not annihilation. And in that revelation, she found a sharper purpose that would carry her toward the final act she had so carefully choreographed. She moved into the final phase of her plan with a quiet ferocity that surprised even her. Because where once she had been broken into pieces by revelation, she now felt assembled into something deliberate and inevitable. A force that had learned to wear patience like armor and cruelty like a scalpel. And as the net she had woven tightened around her family, their panic became the music to which she marched. For panic reveals truth as heat cracks stone and exposes the hollows beneath. And she loved watching the confident fall into uncertainty, watching the pillars they had built their lives upon reveal hollow cores of shame and cowardice. And yet, even as their world trembled, she took care to control the tempo of ruin, to let consequences accumulate until the tiny fractures she had planted became avalanches that could not be stopped by apologies or denials. Because she had learned that when people are forced to confront the ugliness they have hidden, they do not simply confess and mend. They scramble to save what vanity they can while the rest collapses, and that collapse would be her triumph. She began to orchestrate public exposures with the same refinement she had used in private, evidence that would not only humiliate, but also make clear how deeply the betrayal ran. Documents that proved the deliberate concealment of lineage, letters that showed the cold calculations of elders who preferred reputation to truth, statements from those once silenced who now spoke with the authority of accumulated grievance. And as each piece came into the light, the community that had once upheld her family began to turn. Because social judgment is swift and merciless when fed by scandal, and she watched as neighbors who had once smiled politely at family gatherings now averted their gazes, as acquaintances who had once sought their favor quietly closed doors, and the isolation that had been intended for her returned to its senders, wrapping them in a suffocating loneliness they had never imagined feeling. And in that loneliness even the proudest among them found their voices falter. The man she had married, once the axis of her small universe, found himself unmoored as whispers seeped into his life in places he had thought secure, and his confusion hardened into anger, at times spilling over in sharp words he had never used with her before. But she met him with a calm so absolute it sounded like finality, because she knew that his anger came from loss of control rather than conscience. And control is a fragile thing when foundations shift. And when he finally stood before her demanding to know if she had engineered his ruin, she looked at him, not with pleading but with a clarity that she had never had the right to show before. And she named each betrayal, each lie, each act of cowardice that had shaped her into the woman he thought he knew. And he had no language left to deny the truth because the documents, the witnesses, the shifting loyalties around them spoke more loudly than his protests. and in his silence she saw the true cost of what secrecy buys. The slow erosion of humanity, the trade of compassion for convenience. And she felt no reprieve in his downfall because his pain was only a mirror of the pain she had felt for years. Yet even as she orchestrated their public disgrace, she was careful to guard herself against becoming the very monster she sought to punish. Mindful that revenge, if untethered, eats the soul that feeds it. And so she tempered some of her actions with a merciless logic, exposed the truth so thoroughly that denial is impossible. But do not destroy what might yet be rebuilt through acknowledgement and restitution, for she understood that vengeance served a greater purpose when it forced change rather than merely indulged cruelty. And her deeper aim had always been to unchain the next generation from the secrecy that had bound her, to ensure that no child in their line would wake one day to find love had been a lie masked by silence. As the days of reckoning multiplied, so too did the enemies she had made, not all of them from her family. There were those in the community whose fortunes were tied to the family's standing, those who feared the consequences of upheaval, and who whispered accusations against her in dark corners, attempting to paint her as a vindictive woman bent on destruction. And the more they spoke, the more she realized how easy it is for societies to collude in silence when they benefit from it. How often the meek are sacrificed to maintain appearances, and how deeply injustice is woven into the very fabric of social life. And that awareness hardened her resolve to not only expose the crime, but to dismantle the system that permitted it. For if secrecy could claim her life, then secrecy was the real culprit that must be brought to light. Her closest ally, the distant relative who had risked everything to join her, grew into a steady presence, offering proofs she could not find alone, providing names and dates, memories and confessions that tightened the cases she presented. And together they became a dangerous team of two who asked the right questions at the right time, who knew where to turn gossip into evidence, and who could take a lifetime of hidden wrongs and make them legible to those who needed to see them to change. As the pressure increased, the patriarch of the family, who had once ruled with quiet authority and a vocabulary of polite cruelty, began to show signs of frailty that were not solely his age. Moments when his hand trembled over his tea, nights when he could not sleep because memories he had buried now rose like corpses from a shallow grave. And when he finally confronted the truth not with defiance but with a broken apology that had more to do with fear than repentance, she felt a complex current of emotions: vindication, sorrow, disgust, and she realized that forgiveness might be possible, but it would be a strange thing offered on her own terms. Because apology without admission is cheap and apology without consequence is meaningless, and she would not permit cheap absolution to erase the damage done. The climax of her orchestration came on a cold afternoon when the town council, pressed now aware and hungry, convened in a hall that once hosted celebrations for the family, the room filled with faces that had known them for years, some drawn in sympathy, others drawn by the spectacle. And she stood at the edge of that hall, not as a trembling woman, but as an accuser, armed with a dossier that contained everything necessary to move hearts and law. And when she stepped forward to speak, she did not raise her voice in hatred, but spoke with the measured force of someone delivering a verdict, recounting, with precision and unassailable clarity, the history of concealment, the ways in which the family had weaponized silence, the harm done not only to her but to many. And as she spoke, the air changed. A hush that felt like judgment settled over the room, and one by one testimonies corroborated what she said until the patriarch's facade crumbled in full view of all those who had once sustained it. And when the final witness described the moment a child had been denied knowledge of their own origin, the room erupted not with anger alone, but with a painful recognition of complicity, and in that moment, her vengeance felt less like punishment and more like justice, delivered with all the blunt force the law and conscience could muster. After the council's decision, which ordered public reparation and formal acknowledgement of the harm done, the tangible effects of her campaign began to unfold. Apologies were issued under pressure. The family's public roles were stripped, and community rituals that had once honored them were withdrawn. And while some rejoiced at the sound of their downfall, she recognized the hollowness of vindication. For years cannot be rewritten by a formal decree, and healing would be slow and uncertain. But the most significant change was not the humiliation of those who had wronged her, but the opening of a space where truth could be spoken aloud without fear, where secrets no longer hid behind polite smiles, where the next generation could ask questions without being told to be quiet. And in that opening she found, finally, a measure of peace that did not erase her scars but made them meaningful, because they now served as markers of survival and of a small, hard-won freedom. Yet even as she stood amidst the aftermath of her long campaign, she felt a new unease settling in her chest, for victory had not brought the full closure she had imagined. Instead, it had revealed that power has a price, that the act of dismantling a life built on secrecy leaves behind ruins where ghosts can linger. And as she walked through those ruins, she understood that the true work of rebuilding would fall not only on those who had been wronged, but also on those who had wielded power. And the reckoning she had started would have to continue in other forms, through education, through law, through constant vigilance, so that silence could never again be used as an instrument of harm. And in that recognition she found a purpose beyond revenge, a direction to channel her fury into creating structures that protected choice and dignity for those who could not defend themselves. And it was in this shift from punishment to prevention that she finally felt the burden in her chest remit its heat by a fraction, because she saw that her suffering might be transformed into something that helped others rather than only avenged her. And in that small mercy she began to imagine a future that contained a sliver of hope amid the ash. She knew the story was not over even after the council's judgment, because punishment had been passed, reputation shattered, truths exposed. Yet the silence within her remained restless, whispering that curses are not undone by words or decrees, that wounds of such depth do not close merely because society has acknowledged them. And she carried that whisper like a shadow clinging to her back as she returned to her home, a home that now felt less like a refuge and more like a theater where memories replayed themselves against her will, where every corner reminded her of love that had been false, of vows that had been poison, and of nights when she lay beside a man whose very existence in her life was a cruel trick played by bloodlines disguised as destiny. She found herself walking through rooms as though they belonged to someone else, as though she were a guest in the remnants of her own story, and the walls seemed to hum with betrayal until she wanted to tear them down brick by brick. But she resisted because destruction alone could not free her. She had already destroyed what needed to be destroyed. Now she had to survive it, and survival was the hardest part, because it meant living with echoes that could not be silenced by rage or even by justice. The man who had been her husband wandered the edges of her days like a ghost, sometimes appearing with eyes full of blame, sometimes with eyes full of sorrow, never with the courage to fully face what he had been part of. And though he wanted her forgiveness, she found herself unwilling to grant him words that would let him sleep easier, for she knew that forgiveness would not heal her, it would only absolve him, and she refused to give away the last fragments of power she had clawed back with such cost. At times she thought about leaving everything behind, vanishing into another place where no one knew her, where the curse of her past could not follow. But she realized that running was only another form of silence, and she had sworn never to live in silence again, so she chose instead to remain, to walk openly through the same streets where once she had walked in shame, daring anyone to meet her eyes, daring anyone to reduce her story to gossip, because she had learned that shame belongs not to the one who suffers, but to the one who causes suffering. And by holding her head high, she shifted that burden back to those who deserved it. Yet even in her defiance there came moments of weakness when she felt the weight of loneliness pressing like stone on her chest. For she had lost not only a husband and a family, but also the very belief in love that had once carried her. And without that belief the world seemed stripped of color, drained of tenderness, and she feared she might never again feel the kind of trust that allows one to rest in another's arms without suspicion. But then she remembered that curses take many forms, and one of them is the lie that says brokenness is permanent, and she resolved not to accept that lie, even if it took years to rebuild herself piece by piece. because her survival had already proven that what is meant to destroy can instead create a new strength if endured long enough. Nights became her companion, long hours spent staring into the dark, not with fear but with a strange intimacy, because the dark no longer threatened her. It spoke to her. It told her that every secret eventually finds a mouth, every injustice eventually meets a witness, and every betrayal plants the seed of its own destruction. And she held on to those truths as a map for the years ahead, a reminder that the silence she had once cursed had also given her power, that her suffering had not been meaningless, and that even if scars remained, they would mark her not as a victim, but as someone who walked through fire and emerged carrying the flame. When the years passed and the scandal became less spoken of, when her family had either fled or withered under the weight of disgrace, when even the whispers had lost their sharpness and the world seemed to have moved on, she remained not untouched but unbroken, and in her endurance she found a strange kind of victory greater than revenge itself, because she realized that survival is the ultimate defiance, that to keep living, to keep walking, to keep breathing, when everything has been taken from you, is a power that outlasts both love and betrayal. And in that realization she felt the curse that once bound her begin to loosen, not vanish but weaken until it was no longer a chain but a scar. And scars, though permanent, do not bind. They remind, they warn, they teach, and they prove that what once tore you apart could not in the end destroy you. And with that knowledge she closed the final chapter of her story, not with peace, not with joy, but with a strength so unyielding that even the shadows around her bowed in recognition. She stood at the edge of her journey, not in triumph, nor in ruin, but in a strange space between where endings and beginnings blur. And as she looked back at the path she had walked, it seemed less like a straight line and more like a labyrinth carved by unseen hands, every turn marked by betrayal, every corridor echoing with secrets, every chamber filled with shadows that once tried to swallow her whole. Yet she had come through them alive, altered but unbroken. And in that survival there was a power more profound than revenge itself. For revenge had burned hot and fierce, but survival was a fire that endured even when the fuel was gone. And she realized now that endurance is the one victory no enemy can take away. Her family had been scattered, some clinging to denial, others consumed by disgrace, their once proud name reduced to whispers and warnings, a lesson spoken among neighbors about the cost of hiding sin. And though they would live on in fragments, they would never again command the silence of others. And in that truth she found a measure of justice that no counsel or decree could grant. For the curse that had once bound her was no longer hers to carry. It belonged to them now, sewn into their legacy, passed down not as honor but as caution, and she had ensured it would never be forgotten. The man who had been her husband drifted into obscurity, haunted by the knowledge that the love he offered was a lie written in blood. And though he sought forgiveness in letters she never opened, she knew that his suffering was his own to endure, and she bore no obligation to ease it, for forgiveness, she understood, is not a gift owed but a choice made, and she chose instead to keep her silence, the same silence they had once used against her, turned back now as a weapon more cutting than any words, because absence is sometimes sharper than presence. And she let that absence become her final answer to him. Yet even as she closed the doors behind her, she felt the weight of social injustice pressing on her thoughts. For her story was not unique, it was only louder, more visible, and she knew there were countless others living in the shadows of silence, bound by secrets that twisted their lives into cages, and she felt a responsibility rise within her, a duty to turn her survival into something greater than personal vengeance. To become a voice where silence had once ruled, and so she began to speak, not of her family directly, but of the dangers of secrecy, of the cruelty of shame, of the need for truth even when it wounds, and her words spread like sparks in dry grass, catching in the hearts of those who had long suffered quietly, and soon she was no longer alone in her fight, for voices that had once trembled began to rise beside hers, and together they formed a chorus too strong to be silenced, too determined to be ignored. Time did not heal her wounds, but it gave them meaning. And meaning is a form of healing deeper than forgetting. For forgetting erases, but meaning transforms. and she carried her scars not as marks of shame but as proof that she had endured what was meant to end her, and that endurance had become her inheritance. The only legacy she would pass to those who came after her, not a name tainted by lies, but a truth sharpened by pain. A truth that said no one has to live in silence. No one has to accept chains disguised as love. No one has to bow to curses born of other people's sins. In the quiet of her later years, she would sometimes sit alone in the dark. The same dark that once terrified her, and she would smile because it no longer held power over her. It had become her ally, her witness, her mirror, and she whispered to it the final truth she had learned, that love may deceive, family may betray, society may condemn, but silence, when broken, becomes the most powerful voice of all. And with that whisper, the shadows around her seemed to listen, seemed to bow as if even they recognized that she had mastered them. And in that mastery she found at last the closure she had sought. Not peace, not joy, but something stronger. A strength carved from betrayal, tempered by revenge, and crowned with the unshakable truth that she had turned her curse into her power, and left behind a world that would never forget her story.